January 17, 1945. Bougainville Island, Solomon Sea. The women knelt in silence on the damp earth, their hands bound with fraying rope, their backs pressed against the corrugated metal wall of a makeshift detention shelter. Dawn had not yet broken. The air hung thick with the scent of salt and rotting vegetation, and somewhere beyond the perimeter, the jungle exhaled its ancient, indifferent breath. They did not speak. They did not weep. There was nothing left to say. For 3 days they had watched the American soldiers move through the camp with a peculiar efficiency, cataloging names, checking documents, photographing faces. They had seen the gallows constructed in the clearing to the east, the rough-hewn timber still smelling of fresh sap. They had heard the whispers among the guards, half in pity, half in certainty. By morning they believed it would be over. Among them sat a young nurse named Miyako, 23 years old, whose hands still bore the faint chemical stains of iodine and carbolic acid. She had spent 2 years tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific, Rabaul, Truk, then finally here, on this forgotten strip of volcanic rock, where the Empire's ambitions had crumbled into mud and desperation. She remembered the propaganda broadcast from Tokyo, the voice of the announcer trembling with righteous fury as he described the fate of Japanese women captured by the Americans. Violation, mutilation, death without honor. She had believed every word. Why would she not? The stories came from the homeland, from the mouth of the emperor's ministers, from the officers who swore the Americans were beasts in human skin. And now, as the darkness thinned to gray and the first birds began their tentative calls, she prepared herself for the end they had promised her. But what came instead was the smell of coffee. It arrived before the light did, a warm, bitter, impossibly rich aroma that slipped through the gaps in the shelter wall and curled around the women like a ghost. Miyako lifted her head. Beside her, an older woman named Sachiko, a nurse supervisor with graying hair and a face carved by exhaustion, closed her eyes and inhaled as though the scent alone could sustain her. For a moment, no one moved. Then the door opened and 2 American soldiers stepped inside, carrying wooden crates and a heavy canvas sack. They did not carry rifles. They did not shout. One of them, a tall man with freckles scattered across his sunburned nose, smiled awkwardly and said something in English that none of the women understood. The other soldier, shorter and darker-haired, set the crate down and began unpacking its contents with the methodical care of someone who had done this many times before. There were 10 plates, 10 cups, a steel pot still steaming, and food, more food than Miyako had seen in 6 months. Scrambled eggs, pale yellow and glistening with butter, slices of toast, golden brown and stacked like tiles, strips of bacon, crisp and fragrant, condensed milk in small cans, sugar in paper packets, jam in glass jars with labels printed in English. The soldiers moved through the shelter, placing a plate before each woman, filling each cup with coffee so hot it fogged the air. They did not speak harshly. They did not touch. When they finished, the taller one nodded once, almost shyly, and they left. For a long time, the women simply stared. Miyako looked down at the plate in front of her. The eggs were still warm. A thin curl of steam rose from the toast. She could see the individual grains of salt in the bacon, the faint sheen of fat where it had been cooked. Her stomach clenched with a hunger, so profound it felt like grief. But she did not move. None of them did, because to eat this food was to accept a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught, everything they believed, everything that had shaped the architecture of their understanding. If the Americans were monsters, why this kindness? If they were savages, why this care? And if the Empire had lied about this, what else had been a lie? Sachiko spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. "Eat," she said. "If they mean to kill us, let us die with full bellies." Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to eat. To understand what happened in that shelter on Bougainville in January 1945, one must first understand the machinery of propaganda that had brought these women to this moment. The Pacific War was not merely a conflict of armies and navies. It was a collision of ideologies, a struggle for the soul of Asia, and a contest of narratives in which truth was the first casualty. From the moment Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the imperial government launched a campaign of psychological conditioning designed to prepare its citizens, soldiers and civilians alike, for total war. Central to this campaign was the dehumanization of the enemy. American soldiers, the propaganda declared, were demons in disguise, subhuman creatures driven by greed and lust, incapable of honor or mercy. Women, the broadcast warned, would be treated with particular cruelty. Capture meant death, but only after unimaginable suffering. These were not idle threats whispered in dark corners. They were official policy, disseminated through every channel the state controlled. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting American soldiers as grotesque apes with slavering jaws. Radio programs featured testimonies, real or fabricated, from women who claimed to have witnessed American atrocities in China and the Philippines. School textbooks taught children that the Anglo-Saxon race was inherently barbaric, after it had ravaged indigenous peoples of the Americas and would do the same to Asia if not stopped. For nurses like Miyako, who had volunteered for service out of patriotic duty and genuine compassion, the message was unambiguous. Capture was not an option. Better to die by your own hand than to fall into the enemy's grasp. And so, when the American forces advanced through the Pacific in 1944 and 1945, the Japanese military and civilian personnel faced a terrible calculus. Surrender was not merely a tactical decision. It was a spiritual betrayal, a renunciation of everything they had been taught to hold sacred. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, thousands chose suicide over capture, men, women, and children leaping from cliffs or detonating grenades in their own hands rather than face the supposed horrors that awaited them. The scenes were apocalyptic, a testament to the power of narrative to override the most fundamental human instinct, the will to survive. But Bougainville was different. By January 1945, the island had been bypassed by the main thrust of the Allied advance, rendered strategically irrelevant by the rapid American push toward the Philippines and Okinawa. The Japanese forces remaining there, some 30,000 soldiers and a small number of civilian personnel, including nurses, were isolated, starving, and abandoned. They had no hope of reinforcement, no possibility of evacuation. Supplies had dwindled to nothing. Disease ran rampant. The jungle, which had once seemed like an ally, had become a prison. And when the Australian forces who had taken over the mopping up operations from the Americans finally cornered the last pockets of resistance, many Japanese personnel found themselves facing a choice they had never imagined: surrender or slow death from starvation and sickness. For the women, the decision was even more agonizing. They had no weapons. They had no means of escape. And they had been told, over and over, that capture meant a fate worse than death. When the Australian forces overran their position in early January and transferred them to the American-controlled detention facility, the women believed they were simply being moved to a more convenient location for execution. The gallows they saw being constructed seemed to confirm their darkest fears. And so they waited, bound and silent, for the dawn that would bring their end. What they could not have known, what the propaganda had never allowed them to imagine, was that the American military had spent years developing a doctrine of psychological warfare specifically designed to counter Japanese resistance. The Office of War Information and the military's own intelligence branches had analyzed thousands of captured documents, interrogated countless prisoners, and come to a startling conclusion. Japanese soldiers and civilians were not fighting with such ferocity because they loved death, but because they feared capture. If that fear could be undermined, if prisoners could be shown through direct experience that the Americans were not monsters, then surrender might become possible. And if surrender became possible, thousands of lives on both sides might be saved. The policy that emerged from this analysis was radical in its simplicity. Treat prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings. Feed them well. Provide medical care. Show them respect. Document everything. Photograph them smiling and healthy, and use those images in propaganda, leaflets dropped over Japanese positions. The goal was not charity for its own sake, though many American soldiers felt genuine compassion for the prisoners in their care. The goal was to weaponize kindness, to turn the empire's own propaganda against itself by creating living proof that the narratives Tokyo had peddled were lies. And so, when the women prisoners arrived at the American camp on Bougainville, They became subject of a carefully orchestrated campaign. The breakfast on that January morning was not an accident. It was policy. The soldiers who delivered it had been briefed by intelligence officers, instructed to be courteous, to smile, to show no aggression. The food itself was chosen with care. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. The quintessential American breakfast, abundant and wholesome. The kind of meal that spoke not of scarcity and desperation, but of wealth and security. It was a meal designed to say, without words, "We are not what you were told. We do not wish you harm. We have so much that we can afford to share it even with our enemies." Miyako did not understand any of this as she lifted the first forkful of eggs to her mouth. She knew only that she was starving, that the food was real, and that the flavor, salt and butter, and the faint richness of yolk was so overwhelming after months of near starvation that tears sprang to her eyes. Around her, the other women ate in silence, their faces expressions of confusion, relief, and something close to despair. Because with every bite, the foundation of their understanding cracked a little more. If this was how the enemy treated prisoners, what did that say about the empire that had sent them here? What did it say about the officers who had promised them that death was preferable to capture? What did it say about the emperor, whose divine wisdom they had trusted without question? In the days that followed, the women were moved to a larger facility, a sprawling complex of tents and prefabricated buildings where hundreds of Japanese prisoners, soldiers, laborers, and a handful of other civilians were housed under American guard. The conditions were, by the standards of Pacific War, almost surreal. There was enough food, not just enough to survive, but enough to eat until full, sometimes even enough to leave scraps on the plate. There was clean water, pumped from wells, and treated with chemicals that made it safe to drink. There was medical care, American doctors and medics who treated wounds and illnesses without regard to the nationality of the patient. There were even small comforts, cigarettes distributed daily, paper and pencils for those who wished to write, a camp newspaper printed in Japanese that carried news of the war alongside innocuous articles about baseball and American culture. For Miyako, the transition was disorienting. She had expected execution. Instead, she found herself assigned to the camp hospital, where she worked alongside American medics treating Japanese prisoners. The medics were young, most of them no older than she was, and they treated her with a casual friendliness that bewildered her. They taught her English words, bandage, infection, good morning, and laughed when she mispronounced them. They shared their rations with her, even though regulations technically forbade it. One of them, a sandy-haired corporal from Kansas named Tom, showed her a photograph of his wife and infant daughter and asked, through gestures and broken phrases, if she had family in Japan. She did. A mother and 2 younger brothers in Hiroshima. She had not heard from them in over a year. At night, lying on her cot in the women's section of the camp, Miyako would think about the breakfast. It had become, in her mind, a symbol of something larger, not just American abundance, though that was certainly part of it, but a different way of thinking about the world. In Japan, she had been taught that resources were scarce, that the nation's survival depended on discipline and sacrifice, that to waste even a grain of rice was to betray the collective. She had believed in this ethos, had structured her life around it. But the Americans seemed to operate from an entirely different premise. They had so much that generosity was easy. They wasted food casually, tossed half-eaten sandwiches into garbage bins, poured out coffee that had gone cold. It was shocking, almost offensive, and yet there was something liberating about it too. Because if abundance made kindness possible, if security made cruelty unnecessary, then perhaps the war itself was not inevitable. Perhaps it was the product of choices, and those choices could have been made differently. This was a dangerous thought. It undermined everything the empire had taught, everything the women had sacrificed for, and yet it took root in Miyako's mind and would not be dislodged. The historical record of Japanese prisoners in American custody during World War II is both extensive and revealing. By war's end, the United States had captured and interned approximately 41,000 Japanese military personnel and several thousand civilians, primarily in camps scattered across the Pacific and the continental United States. The treatment of these prisoners was governed by the Geneva Conventions, to which the United States was a signatory, though Japan was not. American policy mandated that prisoners receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care, and that they be protected from violence and coercion. In practice, compliance with these standards varied. Some camps were better managed than others, and incidents of mistreatment did occur. But on the whole, the American approach was remarkably humane, especially when compared to the treatment of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands. The contrast could not have been starker. Japanese POW camps were notorious for their brutality. Starvation, disease, forced labor, and systematic abuse were the norm, not the exception. The death rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese custody was nearly 30%, compared to less than 1% for Japanese prisoners in American custody. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected fundamentally different attitudes toward the concept of surrender and the value of human life. In the Japanese military tradition, surrender was the ultimate dishonor, a negation of the warrior's duty to fight to the death. Prisoners, whether Japanese or foreign, were seen as having forfeited their humanity. They were objects of contempt, unworthy of compassion or care. The Americans, by contrast, operated from a tradition rooted in Enlightenment humanism and Christian ethics, a tradition that held, however imperfectly practiced, that even enemies possessed inherent dignity. This was not naive idealism. It was, in many ways, a pragmatic calculation. Treating prisoners well served strategic purposes. It encouraged surrender, facilitated intelligence gathering, and bolstered America's moral position in a war that was as much about values as territory. But it also reflected a genuine belief, held by many American soldiers and policymakers, that cruelty was not strength, and that the measure of a civilization lay in how it treated those at its mercy. For the women on Bougainville, this difference was impossible to ignore. Every meal, every medical examination, every casual kindness from their captors chipped away at the narrative they had been given. And as the weeks passed, something extraordinary happened. They began to trust. Not fully, not without reservation, but enough to speak more freely, to ask questions, to engage with their captors as people rather than demons. Through interpreters, they learned about America, the sprawling cities, the vast farmlands, the notion of individual rights and democratic governance. Much of it seemed fantastical, too good to be true, but the evidence was all around them. The Americans had so much, not just food and medicine, but machinery, trucks, radios, airplanes that filled the sky like flocks of migrating birds. How could a nation at war afford such abundance unless its wealth was real? Sachiko, the older nurse, put into words one evening as the women sat together after dinner, sharing a tin of peaches that one of the guards had given them. "They do not hate us," she said quietly. "I think perhaps they pity us. And that is worse." Miyako understood. Hatred was something you could fight against, something that justified your own anger and resistance. But pity implied superiority, a judgment that you were weak or misguided or deceived. It implied that the pitier knew something you did not. And in this case, the terrible truth was that they did. The symbolic weight of food in this story cannot be overstated. Throughout history, the sharing of meals has been an act laden with meaning, an expression of hospitality, a gesture of peace, a marker of community. In the context of war, where the most basic resources become weapons and survival itself is contested, food takes on even greater significance. It is not merely sustenance. It is power, control, and identity. The Japanese military had long used food as a tool of discipline and indoctrination. Soldiers were taught to endure hunger, to view privation as a test of spirit. The rice ration, meager as it often was, became a symbol of endurance and loyalty to the emperor. To waste food was to betray the collective. To hoard it was to elevate the self above the group. The American approach was fundamentally different. Food, in the American imagination, was tied to notions of abundance, progress, and individual fulfillment. The national identity had been shaped, in large part, by the conquest and cultivation of vast territories, by the industrialization of agriculture, by the transformation of a frontier into a breadbasket capable of feeding not just a nation but much of the world. During the war, this agricultural might became a strategic asset. American soldiers were fed better than any army in history. 3 meals a day, balanced and nutritious, supplemented by luxuries like candy, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola. Rations were designed not just to sustain life, but to maintain morale, to remind soldiers of home, to signify that they were fighting for a way of life worth preserving. When Americans shared their food with prisoners, they were not merely being generous. They were, consciously or not, asserting a worldview. They were saying, "We have enough. We do not need to fear scarcity. We can afford to be kind." And for prisoners like Miyako, who had lived for years under the shadow of deprivation, this message was revolutionary. It suggested that the war was not, as Japanese propaganda claimed, a struggle of survival against annihilation, but rather a conflict between two visions of the future, one rooted in hierarchy, sacrifice, and zero-sum competition, the other in opportunity, abundance, and the possibility of mutual prosperity. This is not to romanticize American society or to ignore its profound inequalities and injustices, which were glaring and real. But in the context of the Pacific War, the contrast was undeniable. Japanese soldiers and civilians, including the nurses on Bougainville, had been told that the Americans were materialistic barbarians, soft and decadent, lacking the spiritual fortitude necessary for greatness. Yet what they encountered was a power that derived strength precisely from its material abundance, a society that could wage total war on multiple fronts while maintaining a standard of living unimaginable to most of the world. The breakfast of eggs and bacon was not just a meal. It was an argument. It was a refutation, delivered in butter and toast, of everything the empire had promised and failed to provide. By March 1945, the women on Bougainville had been in American custody for 2 months. The war ground on. Iwo Jima fell in late February. Okinawa was invaded in April. But for the prisoners, the conflict had receded into abstraction. Their daily reality was a camp, with its routines and rituals, its slow accumulation of small normalcies. Miyako had learned enough English to hold basic conversations with the American medics. She had written letters to her family, though she had no idea if they would ever be delivered. She had gained weight, her face losing the gaunt, hollow look it had carried for so long. She had even laughed, once, unexpectedly, when Tom the Corporal attempted to sing a Japanese folk song and butchered pronunciation so thoroughly that the melody became unrecognizable. But the laughter was bittersweet, because with every passing day, the women had confronted the enormity of what they had lost. Not just the war, which was clearly ending in Japan's defeat, but something more fundamental, the certainty that had once structured their lives. They had believed in the empire, in the righteousness of the cause, in the necessity of sacrifice. They had believed that the emperor was divine, that Japan's mission was to liberate Asia from Western imperialism, that death in service of these goals was the highest honor. And now, all of those beliefs lay in ruins, shattered not by philosophical argument, but by lived experience. The Americans had not tortured them. They had not killed them. They had given them breakfast. It is impossible to quantify the psychological toll of such a transformation. There are no metrics for measuring the death of an ideology, no instruments for gauging the collapse of meaning. But the historical record offers glimpses. Letters written by Japanese prisoners, diaries kept in secret, post-war interviews and memoirs, all reveal a common theme, a profound sense of betrayal, not by the enemy, but by their own leaders. The propaganda had lied. The officers had lied. And the emperor, whose name they had invoked with every breath, whose portrait they had saluted with tears in their eyes, had lied too, or worse. He had been ignorant, a figurehead manipulated by militarists who had led the nation into catastrophe. For some prisoners, this realization led to despair. For others, it sparked a kind of tentative hope. If the old truths were false, then perhaps new truths could be found. Perhaps there was a way forward, a life beyond the ashes of the empire. Perhaps the world was not as small and pitiless as they had been taught. Miyako felt both despair and hope, tangled together in a knot she could not unravel. She thought often of her brothers, wondered if they were still alive, if they would recognize the person she had become. She thought of Hiroshima, the city of her childhood, and tried to imagine it still standing, still whole, though she knew in her heart that it must have suffered. She thought of the future, a vast and terrifying blankness, and wondered what place she might have in it. But most of all, she thought of the breakfast, the eggs, the bacon, the coffee, the taste of butter on her tongue, the warmth of the cup in her hands. The moment when she first understood that she would not die, that the monsters she feared were men, and that the world was larger and stranger and more complicated than she had ever been allowed to know. The epilogue to this story does not end on Bougainville. It extends across decades, across continents, across the long and painful process of reconciliation and reconstruction that followed the war's end. Japan surrendered in August 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reduced those cities to ash and shadow. The empire collapsed, its ideology discredited, its military disbanded, its leaders tried and executed or imprisoned. The nation that emerged from the ruins was fundamentally different, democratic, pacifist, allied with the very powers it had once sought to destroy. The transformation was neither easy nor complete, and the scars of the war remain visible even today. But it happened, and part of what made it possible was the slow, quiet work of changing minds, one person at a time, one meal at a time. Miyako survived the war. She returned to Japan in late 1946, part of a wave of repatriated prisoners and displaced persons trying to find their way home. Hiroshima was gone, obliterated, but her mother had survived, having been in the countryside when the bomb fell. Her brothers were dead, one killed in the Philippines, the other in the final defense of Okinawa. She never spoke much about her time on Bougainville, never told her mother about the morning she had expected to die, about the breakfast that had arrived instead. It was too complicated, too painful, too entangled with questions she could not answer. But she kept one thing from those days, a tin cup American-made, dented and scratched, the kind used in the camp to serve coffee. She kept it on a shelf in her small apartment in Tokyo, where she worked as a nurse in a civilian hospital, tending to the wounds of a broken nation. And sometimes late at night, she would hold in her hands and remember the taste of butter, the smell of bacon, the strange and terrible kindness of enemies who had become, in spite of everything, the architects of her survival. The breakfast on Bougainville was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a deliberate strategy employed by the American military across the Pacific theater. But its significance transcends strategy. It represents a moment of human connection across the deepest divides of ideology, nationality, and fear. It represents the power of truth to dismantle lies, the capacity of kindness to undermine hatred, and the possibility, however fragile, however fleeting, of seeing the enemy not as a monster, but as a person. In the grand narrative of World War II, it is a footnote, a minor detail in a conflict that consumed millions of lives and reshaped the world. But for the women who lived it, it was everything. It was a moment when the architecture of their understanding collapsed and something new, tentative and uncertain, began to take its place. And perhaps it is a larger truth this story reveals, that wars are won not only on battlefields, but in the quiet, unglamorous spaces where human beings confront each other across the abyss of propaganda and fear. That victory is not just a defeat of armies, but the erosion of the lies that make war possible. That the most powerful weapon is not the bomb or the bullet, but the simple, radical act of treating the enemy as human. The women on Bougainville had been told that Americans were demons. Instead, they were given breakfast. And in that single, unremarkable gesture lay the seeds of transformation, not just for them, but for the world they would help rebuild from the ashes. The tin cup sits on a shelf in Tokyo, a silent witness to a moment when the dawn brought not execution, but eggs and coffee, and the world, for a few women on a forgotten island, became something other than what they had been told. It is a small thing, a relic of a long-ago morning, but it endures, like memory, like hope, like the stubborn, improbable belief that even in the darkest hour, kindness is possible, and that even the most carefully constructed hatred can be undone by the simplest act of compassion. The war ended, the empire fell, and the women who had knelt in that shelter, waiting for death, lived to see a future they had never imagined. They lived to see Japan rise from the ruins, to see their children grow up in peace, to see the world transformed. And though many of them never spoke of that January morning, though the memory remained too painful, too complicated to share, it shaped them nonetheless. It taught them that the world was larger than the lies, that abundance was possible, that kindness was not weakness but strength. It taught them that the enemy could feed you, and that breakfast, in the end, was more powerful than propaganda. The The sun rose over Bougainville on January 17, 1945, and the women who had waited for death received instead a meal. It was, in its way, a kind of resurrection, a return to life from the shadow of the grave. And in that moment, something shifted, not just for them, but for the idea of what was possible, what the future might hold, what it meant to be human in a world torn apart by war. The eggs grew cold. The coffee was drunk. The morning passed. But the memory remained, a testament to the strange and enduring power of a single act of kindness in a time of hate. A breakfast instead of an execution. A future instead of an ending. A truth instead of a lie. And in the end, that made all the difference.